The Saturn V detailed design really got going in earnest at the Marshall Center in the latter part of 1961 after Kennedy's decision to go to the moon before the end of the 1960s. The design effort required a period of about 2.5 years, which is very short by any standards we're used to today. That came about largely because of the extreme level of competence of the group working under Dr. von Braun. That competence was both technical and managerial. By about 1964, the first heavyweight versions or development versions of all of the stages were being static fired. And also during the same period, the first sets of flight hardware, flight stages, were being produced. This sort of concurrent execution in design, production of development hardware, and production of flight hardware was made necessary by the very tight schedule that the program was working under. And by the middle of 1966, the 500F vehicle, the so-called facilities vehicle, was on the launch pad. And that facilities vehicle, with the exception of operational engines, was an operational vehicle in just about every other respect. The record of success of the Saturn V, which was essentially complete success, was brought about by essentially two programs that were both out of Huntsville and of very high quality. The first was the engineering effort that went into the design of the vehicle. The second was a test program that supplemented the design program, the test program being of quality that was equal to that of the design program. I've heard numerous stories circulated over the years told to me by people who worked at the Cape during the Saturn program, having to do with the feelings and attitudes of the contractors toward the von Braun group at Marshall. Those feelings were sort of a combination of great respect and out-and-out fear. The von Braun group at Marshall had a very natural ability. They'd been working in rocketry for 30-plus years at the time of the Saturn design. And they had acquired an ability to structure a test program that would very systematically expose the flaws of a piece of hardware that was under test. And of course, nobody in the design ranks likes that. Nobody likes to spend 6 months in the design of a piece of hardware and then see somebody that we don't know completely shred that piece of hardware, at least figuratively speaking, in the early part of a test program. Nobody likes that at all. Engineers don't get a warm, fuzzy feeling about themselves as a result of things like that. In sending vehicles into space, such things are necessary to determine the real operating limits of a component or a system. And the operating limits of all the components and systems need to be understood before the systems are entrusted to carry people. Dr. von Braun and his people at Marshall had a deserved reputation for being somewhat ruthless in that regard. As successful as the Saturn V was in its operational service, and that success was essentially perfect over a program of 13 launches, there were phenomena that could not be completely diagnosed before first flight, simply because in the early and mid-1960s, the computer capability to do so did not exist. Even today, the early part of the 21st century, there are some problem conditions with launch vehicles that can't really be resolved or insight into them gained until the vehicle flies for the first time. A very common problem that has been troublesome for almost every new launch vehicle of any significant size has been a problem involving lengthwise vibration of the vehicle structure, vibration somewhat similar to the bellows of an accordion. Someone long ago decided that this phenomena reminded them of a child jumping along on a pogo stick, and so this situation was dubbed pogo. Now, pogo has occurred in almost every new launch vehicle that the U.S. has ever built. However, when it occurs in a vehicle the size of the Saturn V, the problem can take on a new degree of seriousness. This can come about for a couple of reasons. First, the vehicle itself is simply large enough that the amounts of energy involved become very large. Secondly, the launch vehicle and long runs of propellant piping tend to have low natural frequencies, and the natural frequencies of the vehicle structure and the piping stay close enough to each other to be a problem for a longer period than is usual in smaller launch vehicles. In addition, since this hardware is all built to blueprints, engineering blueprints that have tolerances associated with them, and these tolerances get larger as the vehicle hardware gets larger, two consecutive Saturn V rockets, both built to perfectly acceptable prints, may display dynamic characteristics that are noticeably different from each other. This was one of the facts that made the Saturn V notably difficult to manage from a standpoint of the dynamics of the vehicle structure. It turns out that the Saturn V was really fairly messy from a dynamic standpoint, primarily due to its large size and efforts to keep its weight under control. Each of the three stages, the S1C, the S2, and the S4B, all displayed their own separate and distinct pogo problems. And again, the pogo problems seem to have been somewhat marginal. They were tolerance related, and they showed up differently in different vehicles in the program. As an example, the S1C, the first stage of the Saturn V, displayed a pogo problem that was pretty textbook in nature, and it had to do with the lengthwise structural natural frequency of the integrated stack and the acoustic natural frequencies of the LOX feed lines in the S1C stage running from the LOX tank to the engines. Those natural frequencies all lined up at a value of about 5 cycles per second, or 5 hertz, during the latter part of powered flight on the S1C. However, while the second vehicle, which was 502 or Apollo 6, showed that problem very clearly, and in fact to a fairly alarming degree, the first vehicle, which was 501, Apollo 4, didn't show pogo in any significant manner at all during first stage boost. Now the S2, the second stage, had a pogo problem of its own, and this was around for most of the Saturn V program. The second stage of the Saturn V, the S2, exhibited its own pogo problem, and this pogo problem was around for most of the Saturn V program. It turns out that when propellants in the S2 were depleted to levels of about 30%, the stage structure which of course includes the propellants, had a natural lengthwise vibrational frequency of around 18 hertz. Now, it was also known from previous testing that the J2 engine LOX system, and particularly that of the center engine, would respond at about that same frequency at about the same time in flight. Well, the S2 on Apollo 8, which was the third vehicle, 503, did indeed exhibit a mild pogo oscillation during the latter part of its firing period. And most of that response was associated with the center engine. On Apollo 8, it turns out that the coupling between the engine's LOX system and the rest of the stage was not particularly strong, and pogo damped out after a period of about 30 seconds. Now, on the next vehicle, 504, Apollo 9, the same phenomena was observed, that is, a coupling between the oxidizer system of the center engine and the S2 stage structure. But the amplitudes that came about were about 15% higher than on the previous flight, and they started and ended at about the same time. Now, with 2 consecutive flights exhibiting this phenomenon, Apollo 10 was programmed to shut down its center engine about 40 seconds before the time that the pogo coupling was expected to occur. It was thought that that would constitute a fix for the S2 pogo problem, but they didn't quite know what they were up against. This was Apollo 13. Now, as it happened, there was another discussion going on at about the same time that NASA people were contemplating the change out of the command module pilot of Apollo 13. And this discussion had to do with, this discussion was going on between people from the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, the manufacturer of the S2, which was North American, and the manufacturer of the J2 engine, which was Rocketdyne. The susceptibility of the S2 stage and the center J2 engine combination to pogo was clearly understood by this time, and a pogo suppression device had been designed and built which could be retrofitted into the S2. In fact, a similar device had been implemented on the S1C following the Apollo 6 flight and had been found to be quite effective. The problem in this case was that installing this pogo suppression device would require a longer time than was available in the schedule until launch. The people involved convinced themselves that things would probably be okay, but again, this was Apollo 13. During the launch of Apollo 13, the first indications of pogo oscillations on the S2 stage occurred after a little less than 3 minutes of S2 stage operation. And these oscillations built up and damped out after a period of 10 to 15 seconds. In about another minute, pogo began again and decayed after about the same time. After about 5.5 minutes of S2 operation, there was a quite violent onset of pogo. And this oscillation was large enough to cause the center engine's liquid oxygen pump to do what's called cavitate, which essentially means it swallowed a large bubble of gas. And this caused the center engine's chamber pressure to drop to a low enough value for a long enough time that it allowed the mechanical pressure switch that registered thrust OK for that engine to break its electrical contacts. When that occurred, the instrument unit issued a command to shut down the center engine. The center engine shut down about 2 minutes and 12 seconds before it was intended to shut down. And that early drop in thrust required the other 4 engines to burn about 30 or 40 seconds longer than was originally intended, and required a somewhat longer first burn of the S4B than was intended. Now, although the margin of propellant for the translunar injection maneuver was cut down somewhat, the translunar injection maneuver occurred two revolutions later and was successful. The pogo incident on the S2 on Apollo 13 was kind of odd because the first organized indications of pogo occurred about 4 minutes before they theoretically should have, based on previous flight experience. I don't know for sure what the final outcome was of the investigation into that problem, but I can tell you that the pogo suppression device was installed into the S-2 for Apollo 14, the next flight.
MSTC, CVTS 111.
Go ahead.
Stand by for swing arm 9, retract, T-minus 43.
Roger, we're standing by.
CPSS, CVTS 111.
CPSS.
Verify clear to retract, swing arm 9 to the pole.
Okay, we're coming up on minus 44 minutes, and we're about a minute away from the swing arm retract.
CVTS, this is CGIC 111.
Go ahead.
Pad OIS has been deactivated.
Roger. CVTS is CLTC on 111. Go ahead. Okay, we have concurrence from Marshall and LBO to proceed with S1C vent valve closed. No problem for flight. Roger, I copy. Thank you. CSA 9, CVTS 111.
This is CSA 9, go.
Roger, on your mark, track swing arm 9 to the 12-degree park position and report when complete.
Will comply. Swing arm 9 will be retracted on my mark. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Swing arm retract.
Okay, very good. I don't speak your head, your mind, select the left.
Swing arm 9 is in the park position and stable.
Roger. MSC, the gearbox, set to left.
Go ahead.
Swing arm 9 is at the park position. You clear to arm your CSM buses.
Copy.
Alright, 534 verified. CDR on panel 1, your command module RCS logic switch on up.
Roger, command module RCS logic is on up.
Okay, we got a short wait here. Sequencer, you tracking time? Sequencer? Go ahead. Are you tracking the time for us? Roger. Okay. Okay, you have your 50 seconds. Alright, sequence 536, CDR on panel 8. Your FTCS arm, A and B circuit breakers closed.
Roger, CSS arm. Circuit breakers A and B are closed.
Logic A and B closed.
Logic A and B are closed.
Alright, logic 1 and 2 switches on up.
Logic 1 and 2 going on up.
Sequencer verifies the light. Logic A reached 31.9. Logic B reached 31.6. CDR panel 8, your FTCS spiral arm, A and B switches on up.
Roger, final arms, A and B going on up.
Sequencer verifies the light.
MSTC 111.
Go ahead. Spiral A reached 37.2. Spiral B reached 37.2. Alright, 538 verified. Alright, CSC on panel 2. We want your H2 fans 1 and 2 to off. Alright, we have LAS on. H2 fan 1 off. H2 fan 2 off. And the O2 fans 1 and 2 off. O2 1 off. O2 2 off. Okay, RCS, you ready for pressurization? That's it, Roger. Alright, 540 verified. Alright, CMP on panel 2, your service module RCS, helium 1, A, B, C, and D switches, SR1, CVT release.
Okay. Service module RCS, helium 1, A on up, B on up, C on up, D on up, full go.
Helium 2, A, B, C, and D, on up and release.
Helium 2, A on up, B on up, C on up, D on up, full go.
On your secondary propellant fuel pressure, A, B, C, and D switches, close and release.
Secondary fuel, A, close, B, close, C, close, D, close.
RCS, your service module RCS helium aux, ISO, ABC and D to on. Answer, Roger. Okay. Okay, all stations will complete down through sequence 542. Okay, Jim, we're sitting at about minus 25 minutes in the procedure, and we're 39 minutes on the clock. Now we have to hold up here on the Proton Army, Jim, until minus 25 minutes. Jack, as soon as we get the propellant system armed, stand on. Okay, Jack, as soon as we get the propellant system armed, we'll be reading out all 4 quads. Now we're going to start with A, and what I want you to do is just give us your readings from left to right. Okay. And go the same way for all of them. Okay, well done. Okay, Jim, while we're waiting, I think we'll have you go ahead and set your altimeter elevate. I have a 3950 for you. 3950, okay. Safety command, number 1, carry it on. Is the LES on? CBTS 111. Go ahead. Request range, safety command transmitter number 1 on, verify. Stand by.